Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and the other day I posted a talk on why there's no need to study modern philosophy. And I want to make it clear that what I really intended in that talk, and what I'd like to talk about a little bit tonight, is not so much that there's absolutely no use in the study of modern philosophies. And when I say modern philosophy, I mean philosophy after the discovery of the New World. It's not so much that I'm anti or opposed to the study of modern philosophy, but when we're neglecting the study of sacred scripture as Christians, when we're neglecting the study of the catechism of the church, when we're neglecting prayers, when we're neglecting studies of the church fathers, neglecting the study of spiritual classic works that are known to be edifying to Christian people, because we're all over the place studying, every new idea that comes up in all these different philosophical systems, many of which aren't even held by anyone anymore. We really have to ask if there's a moral issue at stake, that we're neglecting the study of the truth, which we actually need, like healthy food for our bodies, just for this curious interest in knowing every new thing that comes to human minds. I don't think that that's healthy, and I think we're neglecting true studies which are necessary and known to be good for us, for this curious pursuit of a trivial knowledge of every different idea and all of this philosophical vocabulary and so on. We're often pursuing that at the expense of knowledge of the truth, so that's a concern. I also want to talk about modern science a little bit, because this can easily get misconstrued, and I want to try to really make a clear division between what I'm saying when I talk about modern science and criticize modern science and the good of modern science. If we think about what modern science really is, it all begins in the 15 and 1600s. And I like to say it begins with Francis Bacon and the Novum Organum. Francis Bacon really clarifies, I think, the sentiments of that generation that was eager for a separation from scholasticism and Catholicism, and wanted to create a whole new intellectual world. Just like the New World had been discovered across the Atlantic, there was a desire for a new world, philosophically speaking. And the question was, what would the foundation be for this intellectual new world? And I believe that Francis Bacon, who wrote the Novum Organum, which means the new method, he's referring to Aristotle's organon as the old method. It's clear to see that Francis Bacon believed that a new intellectual world could be established on the foundation of experimental science by means of the senses, but not the senses alone, the senses assisted by whatever instruments, devices, or machines man might invent. That was really Francis Bacon's vision for the renewal of human learning, the great reset, as it were, the intellectual new world, as I like to think of it. So we see in Francis Bacon really the formalization of this new intellectual world. With Galileo, who I'll talk about in a minute, we see I think some of the crude sentiments of this new movement, but certainly not ready for prime time as Bacon's ideas were. But here's the problem that I have with modern science. In and of itself, there's nothing negative that can be said of modern science. There's nothing negative that can be said of the scientific method. If we've never been, for example, if we've never been 100 miles under the earth, there's nothing problematic with saying that the best way for us to learn what's 100 miles under the earth is to go there, right? Is to try to get 100 miles of the earth and observe it. And in order to do that, we might be able to transport ourselves there in some way, or we might be able to develop some kind of instruments or machines that can do it. A good example of this is the use of rovers on Mars, right? We can't transport a person to Mars, but that doesn't mean we can't see what's going on there, because we can send a machine in our place, and we can use the machine as an extension of our senses. And that's really the idea that I think Francis Bacon was making a case for in the New Organon. And there's nothing negative that can be said about that. There's nothing negative that can be said about using a pair of binoculars to see deer across the field. It's pretty obvious that that's helpful, and that was Bacon's argument. You know, we do this all the time. If I'm on the farm and I want to move something heavy, I don't go out there and try to move it by hand. I don't necessarily call up 10 of my friends and ask them to come and give me a hand. I just get the tractor out and go move the thing using an instrument that man has developed. That's pretty obvious. There's nothing that can be said about that. And so if the scientific method remains entirely innocent as just, an investigative method, right, of the natural world, there's nothing negative that can be said. And when we get into the scientific method, we see that we identify a problem or propose a question that we'd like to investigate. And then in order to give some direction to our testing, to our investigation, we propose a hypothesis. We give a reasonable guess, not really a guess, but a reasonable expectation of what the answer might be, because that allows us to sort of focus our testing and move forward. We propose a hypothesis, and then once the hypothesis is proposed, we go about establishing an experiment by which we can put that hypothesis to the test. And we really can't fail, because if the hypothesis is found to be false, well, we know that that's false. And if the hypothesis is demonstrated to be true, or at least doesn't seem to be proven false, then we know it's worth continuing with, or fine-tuning, or something like that. And so we can see that that's a perfectly natural method to try and learn something. I mean, that's just how we do things, even every day. So there's nothing really profound about the scientific method. It's just the idea that Bacon had that all knowledge of the natural world should be left to that method. That philosophy shouldn't feed in, that religion shouldn't feed in, and so on. We should simply leave all knowledge of the natural world to this scientific investigation. And there's nothing wrong about that if we keep it innocent. Now what happens, though, is when some, I have to be very careful not to generalize too much, when some scientists decide to argue against opposing ideas that they don't like, they often like to use science as a club to try and beat people with. And so we'll hear things all the time like science says, scientists say, the research says, all of these generalized anonymous references to science, like when people talk about the weather or use the indiscriminate they to refer to whoever, some source that I don't necessarily want to be responsible for. They use that vague pronoun they. in the same way, we often find people using the term science as some sort of argument, right? Science says, the science trusts the science. That's not science. That's not the scientific method, and we've got to recognize that. The problem is that the scientific method, as much as it makes sense, as clear as it may be or may appear to be sometimes, it's really, in the big scheme of things, it's going to be found in the end to not be that helpful. And we see this in modern. It's really not that helpful. Surely we can learn some things by trying harder. That's basically what the scientific method is. It's an attempt to try harder to see or to hear or to feel things that exist in the natural world. But that's really all that it is. And if we sit back and watch the history of modern science and look at where modern science is today, what we don't find is this continually improving, clarifying movement towards some kind of natural orthodoxy in the natural sciences. If we think about the Catholic Church, I can go and get a copy of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and I can have sitting on my desk a summary of everything that the Church teaches 2,000 years into its history. And everyone in the Catholic Church will agree that this is Catholic teaching. Some crazies on the fringes might oppose it, but that's irrelevant. Everyone can go and learn what Catholicism, what the Catholic Church teaches, publicly and formally, officially. Can we do that in any of the natural sciences? Can we do that in physics? Is there a catechism of the research of the world's physicists? I know that many would like to say that yes, there is, but there's not. We have textbooks. The textbooks change. Information in the textbooks change. And there's a problem with that. There's a problem with that. The fact that the textbooks change when we're talking about natural science is problematic. We'll talk about that in a bit. I can remember when I was in school as a kid being taught things that today are contradicted. And I'm not 150 years old. I'm 48 years old. But I can remember being taught that there are 9 planets. And if you go and search today, you'll find that no one teaches that there are 9 planets. And so we see that there's a desire to make it seem that science is solid and certain, and you can really trust and know that scientific information is true. And that's sort of an ignorant, popular notion of what science actually is, and it's problematic, as I said. Now, what's even more problematic about this misuse of modern science is that, as I said, when men desire to argue against some idea or some system that they don't like, they try to use science to prove it to be false. And what's ridiculous about this is we know that Bacon proposed the scientific method for use in the investigation of the natural world. And so we'll take someone who, let's say, he's a Catholic, like me. This happened today in a discussion, in fact. Someone says Catholicism is obsolete. It was necessary for a period of human history where there was widespread ignorance and superstition, but now science has done this and that, and Catholicism is obsolete. And when you hear a statement like that, the first question is, to what degree has this person even studied Catholicism? Catholicism is a very profound, deep religious faith. The Catechism of the Catholic Church is 3 inches thick. We've got 2,000 years of the development of doctrine and teaching. I really don't think that there are many people working in modern sciences who have carefully and thoroughly studied the teaching of the Catholic Church. So I really don't think scientists should get too much into discussions about whether the Catholic faith is true or false. And I'd say the same of other religions. I'd say the same of Buddhism, Islam, and so on. In fact, I often quote a medieval Arabic philosopher, Al-Ghazali, who had a really great quote near the beginning of one of his works where he said that in order to prove a philosophical system false, one would have to become a master of that philosophical system. One would have to study it to know it better than its teachers know it, because he'd have to not only know it, but go beyond that to also know its faults and then be able to articulate and prove them. So the possibility of disproving a philosophical school or a religious system is really quite a difficult task, and a wise man would respect the difficulty of that and not necessarily assume that it could even be done. If I think about another religion like Buddhism or Islam, I would never think myself able to go and provide a demonstrative refutation of the Muslim faith. I wouldn't even attempt to do so, because I would have to invest so much time and energy studying the Muslim faith to understand it truly and properly, and not just intellectually but also practically, experientially, with the respect for their faith that I would ask them to give to my Catholic faith. It simply would not be possible to do that without making great sacrifices to my own Catholic life, which would really make no sense. And so none of us are really willing or able to make a demonstrative refutation of any other system. So when we hear people talking like that, talking about Catholicism, dismissing something like Aristotelianism or scholasticism, when we know that this person has spent his whole life studying math and science and has never even progressed through an introductory level of study of Aristotle or the writings of Thomas Aquinas or the Catholic religion, we can see that it's really not a sincere criticism. It's often very ignorant and just, flat out inaccurate. But this is how science is often used. And there's sort of this popular use of science that's used in popular circles. And because of the poor quality of education available today, that popular circle is getting broader and broader with a greater and greater portion of the human population. These arguments are more and more common. And it's really unfair to science because it misrepresents real science by this nonsense misuse of the term. If you actually listen to scientists, real mathematicians, real physicists and chemists and biologists and so on, you'll notice that they speak with a lot of humility. They speak very cautiously. They don't make very many strong statements about their ideas. They know that they're dealing in the realm of theory, that much of what they talk about is hypothetical, because that's how science works. We talk about things that we can't directly observe, that even if we can observe them, we observe very little of them. And an honest, true scientist will always keep limits on his speech when he talks about things like that. He'll know that the things he talks about are hypothetical. He could be wrong on many of the points that he speaks about, but it's still worth pursuing. It's still worth investigating. It's still worth testing, and so on. And then we see that there's problems that arise. I just posted a a video recently, and you can find this all over YouTube or the internet, where you'll find people explaining that there's a crisis in modern physics because you've got this Einsteinian theory of gravity about how the universe works and how the celestial bodies move and things like that, sort of this macro level physics. And then you turn around and look down to the microscopic level of things, and we have quantum theory explaining how the microscopic world works, protons, electrons, neutrons, and so on. And these two systems don't go together. And so we find modern physicists acknowledging that the cosmology or the astronomy or physics of Einstein doesn't work with quantum theory, quantum physics. And so we've got this problem. This is called the great problem of physics. And so you may have heard of the string theory. The string theory is an attempt to bring these two things together and explain how they could be true. But all of this is hypothetical. All of this is hypothetical. And again, there's nothing wrong with that, as long as, we pump the brakes when we talk about things and we acknowledge that these things are hypothetical. And even the fact that we're talking about quantum this and Einsteinian this and string theory and this, these are new hypotheses, new theories that have been proposed in place of others that were proposed in the name of science, which have been abandoned. So we can see that science, there's no rock solid certainty in scientific discussions. And again, that's okay, as long as we acknowledge that this is what scientists do. And the good scientists, that is what they do. The good scientists talk about these things as men who are just investigating the natural world, trying to move forward with a hypothesis that they tend to accept because they think it's reasonable, they think it's likely to be true, and they go forward with it to test it and try to figure it out. And again, even if it fails, that's still good because it gives direction for the next hypothesis to be developed. That's how science works. There's nothing wrong with that. But again, what we find in popular circles is the misuse of science. Because to be honest, none of us who aren't professional physicists or mathematicians ourselves really know what's going on at the forefront of research in these fields. The people working in them are a very small number of very, very expert, invested mathematicians and scientists, and outside of them, very few people have any clue what's even going on. And when we come down from the greatest universities and the greatest research labs, we come down to sort of the ordinary colleges and universities, because there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, and really very few of them are of any significant quality, especially when it comes to research. Just because someone is a professor or a student or has a degree or is a high school science teacher or reads scientific magazines or watches science videos, that doesn't mean that he really has any clue what's going on at the forefront of the research. And often what people say about science is not even what the scientists are currently saying, if you let the scientists speak for the sciences. But what happens is we have this use of science as an argument to try and pressure common people to abandon traditional beliefs. And this is often overwhelming for common people. They're afraid to contradict science because that seems like it would be crazy. If I conducted an experiment and measured the distance from planet Earth to Mars, and I carried out experiments and actually performed these measurements and could demonstrate that these measurements were accurate, If someone's religion said that, Mars is 100 miles away from Earth, it's very, very small, and I were to present demonstrative material evidence that showed that it was not in fact close to the Earth, but very, very distant and quite large. When the evidence was presented and the truth was demonstrated, it would be embarrassing to hold a belief that it was close and small. So we understand that we don't want to believe things that can be demonstrated to be false. No one would do that. No one would want to do that. The Catholic Church certainly doesn't do that. But the problem is that it's often said that this or that has been proven to be true, and therefore that common people holding religious beliefs, or even well-educated, highly trained theologians, should abandon traditional religious teachings and beliefs or philosophical teachings because science has proven this or that. That's often used to discourage people and try to force them away from their religious beliefs or philosophical convictions. We could even say preferences. And this use of science is deceptive and misleading. No one should ever abandon a religious belief or a conviction of any kind under the influence of scientific proof, unless there is actual scientific proof. And I know it may make me seem obnoxious sometimes, but I often respond to these statements by simply asking for that proof. Where is that proof? And the response is often, like I said, it seems obnoxious. Like you're supposed to just accept scientific assertions and not actually ask for evidence. But even if I ask for simple sources of evidence, like whether a person talking about atoms can actually provide evidence that atoms exist, other than just this hearsay talk about what scientists know, which is not scientific talk anyway. They'll often get annoyed and act like I'm just being a skeptic or I'm just being obnoxious when I'm being sincere. I don't have this or that evidence. I've never seen this or that demonstrated. So I would never make or accept an assertion concerning such and such because I've never been able to observe it. That's what science is for. I can't make a scientific statement when I have never observed something. I can't make a scientific statement if I have never observed something. I can simply report perhaps what someone else claims to have observed. The problem with that is we've got claims what other people have observed with respect to religious beliefs and teachings. Moses claimed to speak with God in a burning bush. So if I learn of an observation claimed by a distant researcher whose observation I personally can't confirm, and I also hear of the report of an observation of an ancient prophet that I can't personally confirm, I've got a choice between two ideas that are proposed to me. And neither one of them is proposed to me scientifically. They're both proposed to me to be chosen on the grounds of faith, to trust in one of the sources or the other, or both, or some combination of them, or to deny both of them. But that's not scientific reasoning. That's not scientific language. It's really the same thing we're already doing in religion, I'm reading the scriptures, and I'm reading of the testimonies of men based on their observations. It's entirely scientific in the sense that men are reporting what they observe. Moses reports that the Red Sea opened and the Israelites walked across on dry land. That's scientific statement. Now, if I say, bah, I don't accept it, I don't believe it, well, that's unbelief. That's unbelief. And we should be able to acknowledge that Moses was not asking us to believe in something that no one had ever seen. This is a common misrepresentation of religion. Moses didn't say, hey guys, you know what we should believe? Check this out. Here's my idea. There was a creator, and this creator was like really big and stuff, and he said, let there be light, and then, Shazam, there was light and stuff. That's not how the scriptures actually work. It's not men asking us to believe things that they themselves are proposing or making up. It's often historical accounts of things that men see and hear and experience that they're recording, and these things are presented to us to be received by faith, often because they have a significant theological or moral implication. And we receive those things by faith. And so when someone comes up to me and says, oh, you can just take anything. Oh, it's been proven. It's been proven that the earth moves around the sun. Really? Really? It's been proven that the earth actually, absolutely moves around the sun? That's actually been proven? I have never seen that demonstration. I'm not sure that anyone who tells me that has actually seen that demonstration. So I believe that someone is telling me that because he's heard of that and he believes it. And he's telling me to believe in his message about this experiment. And for me, it's a matter of faith. And if it would be presented like that, I think it would be honest and fair. But when someone presents a truth like this, a claim, I should say, a claim like this to me, and says that, oh, the proof is out there. Scientists have shown. As a Christian, I feel like I'm being presented with an article of faith to be received by trusting in this man's assertion that someone somewhere has demonstrated something. Now, when I already have a set of articles of faith that I hold, and there are reasons why I hold them, and maybe I've even put them to the test and have found them to be enlightening and helpful and edifying, and so I have more reason to believe them, and someone comes and asks me to believe something that contradicts something I already believe, my inclination is to say, no, I'm not going to abandon this. I'm not going to abandon this belief for this belief unless there's some persuasive reason to do so. And saying that, oh, well, science has shown, or, oh, well, it's been, like, I don't have access to that evidence any more than I have access to Moses' conversation with God in a burning bush. I have no more access to either of those sources, supposed sources of truth. And this, from my perspective, this is what I feel science does to the common people. It often asks them to abandon traditional beliefs and philosophical doctrines that have been held and found very helpful and reliable and beneficial for centuries or even millennia. It asks common people to abandon all of those things by some appeal to science. And for some reason, maybe because of personal preference, but for some reason, common people often feel very overwhelmed by this pressure to believe in a scientific testimony, which is really not scientific at all, rather than a religious or a philosophical testimony or argument. And I think this is where the use of modern science troubles me as a teacher because I see it being misused, especially where there's apparent contradiction. And so we can see a good example of this with Galileo. And I know that as I talk about these things, there will be people who try to immediately, characterize me as some crazy medievalist and things like that. And that again, that's part of the problem with these discussions. If you don't just, in fear and awe, lay down before scientific claims, you're immediately labeled as some kind of crazy, superstitious medievalist. But that's just false. You can see me reason through these things. I can explain how I think about these things. And when I say, you really haven't provided me with any evidence, I'm not being a jerk. I'm not being a skeptic. I'm not just, spitefully clinging to something ridiculous. I'm telling you the truth. You haven't presented me with any demonstrative evidence. And really, if you understand the Catholic faith, I have nothing to fear, because I'm confident that if you did find something that was demonstrably true, it could be reconciled with that which I believe by faith as a Catholic. So I'm not afraid of any scientific evidence. I simply don't believe that because you say it, it's therefore scientifically proven. That's the difference. I mean, can't you understand the difference between those two things? The fact that you claim it and someone demonstrates it to me are two very different things. And I think people who speak in the name of science need to understand that. They need to understand that they may imagine that they're brilliant, but for someone who actually tries to make judgments with caution based on evidence, they're not providing any evidence. And it's not because they're crazy, it's because they're not providing any evidence. That's the reality. So I'm very interested in scientific research. I'm very interested in modern science. But I also, when I listen to modern scientific talks, lectures, read articles, and so on from scientists, I don't find this arrogant, destructive, wrecking ball language that I find among people who target more common audiences in the name of science to try to force them to abandon their beliefs. Real scientists don't talk like that. Real scientists are quite comfortable disagreeing with one another. Two scientists can sit side by side on a stage, discuss their different views, argue with each other, and then shake hands and be friends and do things together and enjoy life, understanding that they're scientists investigating things. And that's supposed to be the spirit of scientific investigation, not this nastiness that uses science as some kind of club that everyone is supposed to submit to, even if there's a claim made in the name of science. But to get back to Galileo, Galileo, he's one of these people who, I would argue, goes beyond the actual bounds of science. And if we look back at what happened to Galileo, it's often misrepresented and oversimplified. Galileo had a hypothesis about the universe. Perfectly fine. The church has always given freedom to scientists, still does so today. That's why a lot of people think that the church has embraced evolution and things like that. That's not true. It's just that the church respects scientific investigation. Galileo had an idea about how the sun, earth, moon, and stars are ordered in the planets. He had an idea that the Ptolemaic system was not the best system, and that a better system could be proposed. And so he started presenting these ideas. And etiquette in this religious context, as I'm discussing, proper etiquette is for experts to keep this stuff private, to keep this stuff quiet, because it's all uncertain, and their freedom is given to them in sort of an exchange. We'll grant you this freedom to propose any hypothesis and pursue any investigation, but you have to be responsible in this and keep it in your laboratory. Keep it in your laboratory until it's demonstrated. When it moves from not just theory to claim, but from theory to claim to proven, reproducible fact, absolutely certain natural truth that can be demonstrated, then we can bring it to the public. That's fine. But when we bring it to the public, we'll also bring the evidence to the public. And so you see the claim and the evidence come together. And that's what makes it, easy for people to accept and embrace. And so there's this etiquette, this understood agreement that the radicalness, the wildness of scientific investigation is permitted among experts in their laboratories. That's where that belongs. In the same way, to compare this, in the same way that when Martin Luther had his ideas about theology, he was welcome to debate those ideas with other theologians. We can consider them professionals, right? Experts, to debate them in a proper place at a proper time according to a proper method with other theologians in private. And you know what? If Martin Luther could just sweep through all of those other theologians and demonstrate his ideas to be true, the church may have considered his teaching and adopted it, and then, with explanations and evidence, presented it to the people. But in both the case of Martin Luther with his Protestant ideas and with Galileo with his heliocentric ideas, we see the same error take place. Martin Luther decides to go out from the disputation hall with the theologians, and he goes out into the streets and speaks directly to the common people. He breaks that etiquette and goes to the common people, which makes no sense. Likewise, Galileo is told to keep this in the laboratory, private, until it's demonstrated. He refuses to do so. He goes public, publishes a book. So in both of these cases, we see what the sort of red flag of a problem is. The troublesome scientist, the troublesome theologian, will not respect the etiquette of a well-ordered society and wants to, for some reason, rush to the common people who we all know don't have the resources, don't have the intellectual foundation or framework to judge between true and false in these matters. And therefore it's unreasonable, I would even say it's unjust, to bring these ideas down into the streets and have all of these complex, maybe even crazy ideas, which really are not crazy if they're kept in their proper places where they can be teased out and investigated and fine-tuned over time. But they're brought in this sort of raw, wild form, and they're presented to the common people with an authority that's not legitimate. For Martin Luther, it was saying, thus says the scriptures, which is not true. It's his interpretation of the scriptures, and other interpretations can be given. Martin Luther did not prove, when he asked people to abandon their Catholic faith, he didn't prove that the Catholic teaching was impossible. He simply presented another plausible system of teachings, but he presented it to an ignorant populace. He didn't keep it in the disputation hall. And in the same way, Galileo, followed suit. He didn't appeal. He didn't present his vision as a theory that's completely uncertain and unproven at that point, which would have made no sense to present. He presented it as Luther did in the name of Scripture. He presented his theory or his ideas as facts in the name of science. And so we can see this error, this misuse of science, just like this misuse of theology, brought to the common people, which is not the appropriate audience for these things, has some, questionable moral intent behind it, because an honest person wouldn't do that. The great scientists wouldn't do that. The great scientists are not the ones trying to get, into a high school classroom to tell all the kids that they need to abandon their beliefs and believe in string theory. That's not what real scientists do. That's not how they act. That's not how they think. They tend to stay among scientists. They like to be with other scientists, and they like to talk to people who know all the mathematics and who know the history of physics and who know all the research that's been made available and published in respectable journals and things like that. That's the crowd that real scientists stay in. That's the crowd that real theologians stay in. They don't take things to the streets. And so when we see people approaching the public and pressuring them to abandon their religious beliefs and embrace theories, these are people who are not where they belong. And the pressure for people to do that is not just. It's not fair. It's deceptive. It's destructive. It leaves people totally confused because they have no means to discern whether this is true or false, or they don't know. And so what happens is people who are eager to find an excuse to abandon their religion or their philosophical tradition, they will use these calls from the theologian or the scientists. They'll use these calls, these public calls, as a justification for abandoning what really they should be clinging to. This is especially true in matters of virtue and morality. If I'm a 14-year-old kid and some quack scientist on YouTube is telling me that science has proven that God is not real and that there really is there's no such thing as a spirit and human beings have no souls, that this is all made up by some superstitious, crazy medieval monks who are just trying to control people for influence and power. And I'm a 14-year-old kid, and my mother and father say, "Come on, Tommy, it's time to get ready for church today." And I don't want to go to church. It's so convenient for me to say, "Oh, I don't believe this stuff." Well, why don't you believe it? Why would you say that the religion of your parents is not to be trusted? And you say, "Oh, because science has shown," and you can see how that's not true. That's not true. What that boy is saying is not true. He's simply pretending to embrace this message in the name of science as a way of getting out of religious duties as a child in a Christian family. And that's morally unjust. And that's why that stuff is not supposed to go to people who are under the authority of others, like children under the authority of parents, or parishioners under the authority of a parish priest or bishop. The teaching, if there's controversial teaching, it's supposed to be discussed among the authorities, not with those under authority. And so you can see the bad morals or the bad ethic or etiquette of such ideas. And I would argue that when science is used like this, it's being misused. And it gives science a bad look because these people can often easily be refuted. I can quite easily refute someone who makes claims about science and religion who has not studied religion and isn't a scientist. It's not too hard to refute the claims of that person, and it makes science look bad. Just as I would say, when a person appoints himself a preacher of a religion and goes around telling people the Bible says this and Jesus says this, I can easily prove a person like that to be false in most cases, and it makes religion look bad. Religion often gets criticized because of people that really have no authorization to be presenting themselves as public representatives of religion, just as these pseudo-scientists present themselves as representatives of the scientific community when they're not real scientists. So this is my main objection to science, and this happens all the time in education. Education is, I would say, that the most common place where this is found, where we get people in elementary schools and middle schools and high schools who are teaching science classes or math classes, and they're talking to kids who have no means of judging whether what they're saying is true or false, who really don't understand the nature of research, who don't understand what scientists actually say and write, or where their writings are found, or how they're published and things. The kids have no idea. And for them, their fifth grade science teacher may be the most scientific guy they know, but he's not a scientist. Their eighth grade biology teacher or their 10th grade chemistry teacher may be the most scientific person that they know, but they're not scientists. And I really don't think it's proper for people in these positions to be presenting to children. I would say the same even in college these days, because college kids are so poorly prepared. I don't think it's proper to be presenting ideas to children in the name of science, or common people in general, in the name of science, when we're not going to very carefully and clearly and honestly talk about the nature of the scientific method and how scientific investigation works, and that most of these things are still theoretical and hypothetical, and they're being investigated and they're being rejected and changed and tested in different ways. If we're not clear to explain the nature of scientific investigation, but we use science as sort of a god that reveals the truth to us, poor, blind and ignorant creatures of the earth that have no way of knowing if these things are true, that's a misrepresentation of science. And again, I don't think real scientists do that. I think it's these sort of pseudo-scientists, these fake scientists that are just really trying to lead children away from the religion of their parents, the religion of their families, the traditions of their cultures, and so on. And I think that use of science is really evil and should be despised, should be avoided, should not be allowed in schools. The scientific method simply gives us the freedom to investigate. People in schools are not the investigators. They're not the scientists. They're at the bottom of the barrel of this world of scientific investigation. Many of them are not even engaged or involved in any scientific research at all. And yet they're presenting things to kids in a misleading and dishonest way. And I don't think that should be allowed. What's true of schools is also true of popular society, on television, on the internet, and so on. There's so much of this pseudo-science, and my criticism of science really needs to be restricted to this. This is what I'm talking about and referring to. I'm not talking about real scientists. But then again, you can test me on this. If you watch lectures or talks or read articles by real scientists, you'll notice that they don't talk like these arrogant middle school science teachers. That's not how they talk. They'll readily acknowledge that what they propose and the idea that they study and represent in the scientific community is uncertain. They'll admit that. They'll admit it's uncertain, and they'll admit that if someone comes along with better evidence or clearer research, they'll abandon it and move someplace else. True scientists will have no problem acknowledging that. But it's the fakers who come and start talking about science as if it's some kind of infallible source of truth, which only God could ultimately be. So, and that, again, that's another reason why religious belief is not unreasonable. It actually is reasonable to believe that God, who created the world, would be the one who could infallibly explain it to us. That's a very reasonable belief. The idea that human beings who can't even know what's inside their own house half the time, or what's across the street or down the road or at the top of a mountain, can understand the entire universe. That's not a reasonable belief. So to cling to religion and be hesitant to accept science without demonstrative evidence, I would argue, is actually the more reasonable position. That's reasonable, and it shouldn't be discouraged. And we should understand that when we discourage religious belief, when we discourage traditional philosophical convictions with this just sort of reckless skepticism and dishonest misrepresentation of science, we're going to do real harm to these people. We're going to separate these people from the good people in their lives. We're going to lead these people away from established good habits into sort of a wild, chaotic lack of virtue and habit. We're going to do real harm by encouraging people to separate themselves from communities, from traditions, from sacramental systems, and so on, with this dishonest appeal to science as some kind of God. And we've got to be careful with these things. That's why some have said that a little bit of science will make you an atheist. A little bit of science will make you an atheist because when you're in a place where you're only getting a little bit of science, it's probably not good science. And it's probably motivated by some evil intent to try to lure you away from some moral system, some system of virtues or moral philosophy that the person speaking doesn't like and doesn't practice and wants to justify not practicing. That's why I think there's truth to this idea that a little bit of science will make you an atheist. But then they say a lot of science will lead you to God. But I don't think that that's necessarily true. I think what happens is if you pursue a lot of science, you actually end up spending time with real scientists where there's no conflict in these things. You can comfortably bring your religious beliefs along with you as you investigate the natural world, propose hypotheses, arrange experiments, look at the results, adjust or abandon different hypotheses. There's no conflict between real science and religious belief. But the danger is this middle ground of fake scientific talk and this attempt to pull people away from moral uprightness and orthodoxy in religion in the name of science. The same thing happens in religion where fake preachers and self-appointed teachers come in and encourage people to abandon the papacy, to reject the teaching and counsel of their own spiritual directors or pastors, to abandon the doctors of the church and the fathers and the catechism, even their own parents. You see, on both sides, I would say these are sort of mirror image movements that are related in their core principles. Fake religion, pulling people away from real authority. Fake science, pulling people away from reasonable beliefs and good habits. Both evils that need to be resisted. So I hope that clarifies my position, because people get confused because they'll hear me criticize modern science, and then you turn around and come to the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. We've got biology class, physics class, chemistry class, and people are like, what in the world's going on here? I thought you said science is stupid. No, I never said science is stupid. Listen carefully. There's true science, which everyone should learn to some degree. And there's fake science. And the fake science is commonly the science we meet with in schools, on the internet, in our communities, and so on. Just like fake religion is also met in those same places. And I'm trying to teach kids to hold off on these judgments until they actually get a chance to do some real science with real scientists, and not allow, Bill Nye, the science guy, to influence their thoughts about religion and moral philosophy. So I hope that clarifies things. I would love to see Christian kids take up a serious pursuit of the natural sciences, and I would love to see them do so while retaining a confident commitment to their scholastic philosophy or Catholic faith. There's no conflict in these things. I think I'm sort of a living example of this myself. Very traditional in my Catholic beliefs, very loyal to the papacy, very committed to scholasticism and Aristotelian philosophy, but at the same time, respectful to the very simple and obvious value of the investigation of the natural world by means of the senses with the help of instruments, as long as we're actually practicing good science. Proposing problems or questions, proposing intelligent, reasonable hypotheses, developing experiments to put those hypotheses to the test, adjusting or changing hypotheses based on the results of those tests, and continuing to move forward like that. That's what real scientists do. And so we've got to make sure that we hold scientists accountable to that standard of honest and open investigation. Otherwise, it just becomes religion. It just becomes philosophy, which science is not supposed to be. We already have philosophy. We already have religion. We need science to just be science. And when science is just science, then we have good science. And that's what I'm hoping to promote in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. So I hope that's helpful. If you'd like to talk about these things, please get in touch. I don't allow comments on YouTube just because they're just obnoxious skeptics that just post nonsense. So if you'd like to comment or get in touch with me, you can just send me an email. My email is available on the Academy website. Go to classicalliberalarts.com. I hope that's helpful. God bless.